From healthcare to the escalating situation in North Korea and a simmering controversy here at home over voter information, Senator Maggie Hassan weighs in on the issues after her first 6 months in office. Plus, a long-forgotten New Hampshire governor gets a welcome home and an honor reserved for the state's greatest leaders. Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. After having at least one U.S. senator in the majority through the Obama administration, in the era of President Donald Trump, New Hampshire's all-Democratic delegation is in full resistance mode. The newest member of that delegation is here this Sunday morning for an extended discussion on a wide range of issues. Senator Maggie Hassan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Speaking of resistance, the governor and the Secretary of State want to share some public voter information with the President's Election Integrity Commission, and they're encountering some resistance on their own, and you're at the head of a long list of elected officials saying this is not the right thing to do. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I am concerned that some of the data being requested by the Trump Commission is private data, and we should be very clear about what state law allows us to release and doesn't. But the more important issue is this. These claims of widespread voter fraud have been debunked time and time again. The state of New Hampshire has done investigation after investigation and found no significant voter fraud. So I'm very concerned that this commission is really a solution in search of a problem. I'm very concerned that whatever information is provided to the commission will be used for the Trump administration's political goals. And I think that should be deeply concerning. We should be encouraging people to vote, not scaring people away. And there are reports of times when even some attempts to check voter names have resulted in accidentally removing people from voter rolls, which is a real problem. So I just think it's a solution in search of a problem, and I'm very worried about how the commission would go about using the information.
And certainly there seems to be a lot of confusion out there amongst the voting public about what's going out and what's not. Right. Political parties have this information. To a certain extent, the world of commerce is able to access this one way or another. Right. Is it so outrageous that the president and a commission should request this and encounter such a massive resistance?
Well, I think if you look at the initial request, it included information that wasn't necessarily public. And we've always worked in the state of New Hampshire with the state legislature to determine who should have access to these roles and how they should be going about getting the public information. But again, I come back to what is the purpose of this commission, and is this really just an excuse to suppress the vote? And I'm really concerned about that because we've seen efforts in other states to do that, and certainly some of the language coming from members of this commission should concern us that that's their real purpose.
Let's head down to Washington. We're now hitting double digits in the number of your Republican colleagues who have come out in opposition to the health care bill. Do you think there's going to be a vote on this on the week of July 17th? And if so, where's this going?
Well, whether there's a vote or not is up to the Republican majority, obviously. What I'm really concerned about, you know, I've been honored to be in this role now for 6 months to represent the people of New Hampshire. My focus has been on how do we strengthen middle-class families, how do we support job-creating businesses in an innovation economy, how do we keep our country safe, secure, and strong. And I've really tried to focus on how to build on the work we did while I was governor here in New Hampshire. One of the things I hear over and over about from Granite Staters is health care. We need to make it more affordable. We need to make sure everybody has access to quality health care. And what we're seeing from the Republican majority right now are bills that would take health care away from millions while driving up costs for less care. If people buy their own health insurance, if you buy your own, you'd see your costs go up. If you are older, if you're between the ages especially of 50 and 64, this bill would create a new age tax. We need to be coming together and improving on the system we have. We need to make sure that we continue, for instance, the aspects of the Affordable Care Act, like our bipartisan Medicaid expansion, that's so critical to addressing the opioid and heroin crisis. So whatever bill the Republicans put forward really should be an attempt to work across the aisle with Democrats. We put forward some ideas about how to improve things and lower costs, including prescription drug costs, which I hear about all over the state. But what we're seeing from the Republicans is a bill that would strip health care away from millions of people, drive up costs, all for tax breaks for the wealthiest and special interests, including Big Pharma. And that's just not right. And I think that that's why you're beginning to see the effort really flounder.
If the Republicans were to begin extending that olive branch across the aisle, is it possible that the ideas would be incorporated, or is this bill too far gone down a path that the caucus does not like?
Well, look, any bill that rips health care away from millions and millions of Americans and granite staters and takes away Medicaid expansion, so critical to fighting our opioid epidemic, is a non-starter for me. On the other hand, what we do know is that there are things we need to do to stabilize the market. We need to bring down prescription drug costs. I helped introduce a bill that would get rid of the income cliff that many middle-class families face under the Affordable Care Act, so that they can't get the help with their premiums that they need. I've helped introduce a bill to bring down prescription drug costs. I'm on a bill with Senator Shaheen that would provide critical subsidy payments to help keep the cost of premiums low and help stabilize the market. I'm on a bill that would help create the kind of reinsurance pool that we know would be important for insurance companies to deal with the costs of very complex medical cases. Those are all things that we have introduced as Democrats, and we're eager to work with the Republicans on, but we're not going to be a part of ripping health care away from millions of Americans.
You've made election security a big priority of yours so far in your time in office. Explain the concept behind the Hack DHS Act.
Well, one of the committees I'm on is Homeland Security and Government Oversight, and certainly cybersecurity is critical both for our election infrastructure. We know from our intelligence agencies that Russians really work to interfere in our elections, so we need to be strengthening cybersecurity. And one of the things we should be doing with our Homeland Security Department is something the Pentagon has done, which is invited so-called white hat hackers to hack their systems. You vet the hackers first, and then if they find vulnerabilities and offer ways to correct those vulnerabilities, we pay them a bounty fee. I think we should do the same thing with our Homeland Security Department, and so Senator Portman and I have a bipartisan bill to do just that, and so far it's gotten a very good response, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with him and other members of both parties to strengthen our cybersecurity.
All of this electronic interference in 2016, you were in a marquee Senate race. Was there any evidence at all that hackers or anyone was trying to break into your email, your campaign, anything like that?
Well, I haven't been briefed on the specifics of these efforts. Look, what we need to do is make sure that we get to the bottom of the Russian interference with the 2016 elections. They attacked the essence of our democracy, and we need to take this incredibly seriously. Director Comey's testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee made clear that we also need to get to the bottom of whether there are potential ties between associates of the president's and this hacking effort, Russians' hacking effort, and we need to get to the bottom of whether the president tried to interfere with the investigation in any way. And so I think it's really important that we have a special prosecutor in this matter, and it's important that that special prosecutor, former Director Mueller, be given full independence to get to the bottom of this.
Do you believe that the president colluded with the Russians?
I think we have to let this independent investigation follow the facts wherever they lead and hold people accountable accordingly. But right now, what's really important is that the Senate Intelligence Committee continue its bipartisan effort, and that the special prosecutor have full independence to do his work.
And of course, the president meeting with Vladimir Putin on Friday at the G20 summit is somewhat surreal given the situation around all of this. But ahead of that meeting, he was saying, well, this hacking, it could have been the Russians, it could have been somebody else, sending sort of a mixed message. What do you make of that?
I am very concerned that the president fails to take seriously how much of an attack this was on our democracy. 17 United States intelligence agencies have concluded that the Russian government, and very likely directed by Vladimir Putin, interfered with our electoral systems. And now we have more information that indicates that they might have infiltrated at least 21 states' election systems. That's incredibly serious. I'm very disturbed that the president seems to keep trying to deflect attention away from this. And I'm very concerned that in his meeting with Mr. Putin, that he's sending some of the wrong signals to people. We should be holding Russia accountable for their behavior. That's why I joined with 97 of my colleagues, or 96 of my colleagues, to ensure that we hold Russia accountable. We've passed a bill in the Senate to strengthen sanctions against Russia, and I'm very concerned that the president is seeking to weaken that bill rather than sign it.
And this is a question I ask of a lot of sort of the national level folks that come in here, but when you're speaking with with your colleagues, you know, in the Senate cloakroom, does anyone have a sense of what Vladimir Putin is after? Sort of, we know that he seeks to destabilize the West, but his long-term victory, what does he want?
Well, we see this effort to destabilize the West, our democracy as well as other democracies. Only Vladimir Putin knows what he really wants here, but he and his associates are getting a level of attention that I think is encouraging them to continue this behavior. And I think we need to hold them accountable. And I think it is very, very disturbing that this administration seems unwilling to do that.
Given these sort of storm clouds gathering around the White House and the level of partisanship in Washington, are you still willing to work, though, with the president on issues where you might be able to come together?
Look, certainly, if the president will present strategic, comprehensive plans on anything from infrastructure to tax reform, I certainly will hear him out and work with him and his administration. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the kind of steady and strategic leadership that we should be seeing from the White House in terms of foreign policy as well as domestic policy. He talked, for instance, about wanting to strengthen infrastructure, and then his budget proposes eliminating or seriously cutting our Tiger Grant program, which has been so critical to things like the Sarah Long Bridge and the Memorial Bridge here in New Hampshire, as well as other critical infrastructure projects. So I am really concerned that this administration has not focused on how to build the kind of proposals that would allow us to engage in a bipartisan way. Having said that, you know, in the Senate, we continue to work across party lines. I continue to work with members of both parties on things like reauthorizing the FAA, which we just passed out of committee a couple of weeks ago, and that included critical amendments from the Tickets Act that I proposed, which gives consumers more rights when they're flying. And we've passed the user fee bill that reauthorizes the Federal Drug Administration. We're doing things in a bipartisan way when we can, and I'd welcome the opportunity to work with the administration. We're just not seeing the kind of clear and comprehensive proposals from them that allow us to do that.
All right. You mentioned the FAA and the Passenger Act there. We'll get to that in a second, but when we come back, you have to stay with us because we'll have more from the Senator, including her perspective on the potentially deadly quandary that is North Korea.